I was born and raised in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, a place that in the late 1960s still felt like it belonged to another century. You could drive down Main Street on a Sunday morning and see horse-drawn buggies sharing the road with the occasional Model T Ford. Rolling fields of corn and wheat stretched out between neat white farmhouses, and there was a comforting sense that everyone knew your name, even if they'd never actually met you. It was the kind of town where you learned early that your word was all you had, and that a handshake still carried weight. My name is Jenny, and in the summer of 1967, I was 18 years old, working behind the counter of my father's general store. I spent my days measuring out molasses, filling sacks of flour, and trying to ignore the humidity that seemed to hover in every dusty corner. The store was a lifeline for the community folks came in for a loaf of rye bread, a sack of sugar, or just a place to catch the latest news on the radio. My father had opened that shop in 1946 when he returned from the war, and he never imagined that one day his daughter would be the one greeting every customer with a shy smile. Then Jack walked in. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and strong hands that hinted at carpentry work. His hair was dark and slightly wavy, his moustache neat enough that I wondered if he had spent extra time in front of the mirror that morning. But what caught me most were his eyes, a clear, steady blue, that seemed to look right through the rows of canned tomatoes and greet me directly. And beneath it all was the faintest hint of Old Spice cologne, something I associate now with men of a gentler era. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and polite. "Could you tell me where the First Methodist Church is?" It was such a plain question, but my heart skipped a beat. I pointed him down the street and tried not to blush. Before he left, he thanked me kindly and asked my name. "Jenny," I managed, hoping I didn't sound too breathless. "Pretty name for a pretty girl," he said with a grin. And then he was gone, leaving behind a swirl of molasses dust and that faint cologne trail. In the days that followed, Jack became a fixture. He just happened to need coffee one day, then sugar, then salt. My father raised an eyebrow and teased me at dinner. Either he's got the worst organized kitchen in Lancaster, or he's interested in my daughter. I nearly choked on my mashed potatoes, but inside I was dancing with happiness. Looking back now, I realize how different dating was in those days. There were no swipes, no endless group chats, no awkward first messages. You either showed up in person or you didn't. You courted with intention, and you asked a family's permission before you took a young woman out for ice cream. There was a kind of permanence assumed in every step, almost the opposite of today's culture of casual dating. It taught me patience and sincerity. A young man wasn't expected to prove himself in 30 days. He had to prove himself in 30 years. One Sunday afternoon, Jack formally asked my father if he could take me for ice cream in the town square. I remember stepping out into the sunshine as if I'd blinked into a brighter world. The church bells rang, and Jack held the door open for me like a perfect gentleman. We sat on a bench with cones in hand, and I felt both ancient and brand new all at once. I was nervous, of course, slightly terrified that I would say something foolish, but his calm presence put me at ease. He listened when I spoke, laughed gently at my jokes, and walked me home under the shade of elm trees. That ice cream date marked the beginning of something I never thought possible, a love story that would span more than 30 years. In every generation, there are moments that define us. For millennials, it might have been the arrival of the iPhone or streaming TV. For baby boomers, it was the moon landing or Woodstock. For my generation, it was the simple act of showing up in person, of making an effort to be present. Jack showed up. He came to my birthday parties, brought me wildflowers he'd picked on his way over, and always followed through on his promises. A year later, in 1968, he told me he intended to enlist in the army. Even though I worried about what might happen overseas, I admired his sense of duty. He returned home safely in 1969, and we married that summer in a small ceremony at First Methodist Church. My mother made my dress, and Jack wore a suit borrowed from his uncle. We didn't have much by modern standards, but the pews were filled with smiling faces, and the reception featured my father's famous ham sandwiches. Our honeymoon was 3 days in Atlantic City, the salty breeze of the ocean feeling like a portal to a new life. I'd never seen the sea before, and I spent hours perched on the boardwalk staring at the endless waves. That trip was my literal first time leaving Lancaster, and my metaphorical first step into the unknown. I learned that love could inspire courage, that two people could take a leap into uncharted territory, as long as they held hands tightly enough. After we returned, Jack went back to his uncle's carpentry shop, and I started selling pies I baked in our tiny kitchen. Every penny we saved went toward a down payment on our own home. We lived in the back room of my in-laws' house, but in our minds it was a kingdom. We talked about duck eggshell blue walls and creaky hardwood floors we'd refinish ourselves. We spoke of children, 3 of them eventually, and gardens full of strawberries and herbs. Not everything was smooth sailing. In 1970, I was 5 months pregnant when I went into labor prematurely. We lost our baby boy, whom we'd planned to name Joseph. I will never forget the heartbreak of that white coffin, or the hollow ache that followed. But Jack surprised me instead of pulling away. He held me closer. He let me cry in his arms without apology. He whispered that our Joseph was watching over us, that one day we'd have more children. And in 1972, he was right. Our daughter Mary arrived, followed by John in 1974, and Lucy in 1977. Building a family felt like building a cathedral out of everyday moments. Jack never thought housework was women's work. He scrubbed floors, changed diapers, and made dinners when I was exhausted. Once a month, he insisted on a date night, sending our 3 little ones to my mother's house, while he lit candles and played soft tunes on his old radio. He'd pick up a bottle of cheap wine and set it on the table, and we'd dance slowly in the living room, exactly as though we were those new lovers from the general store all over again. We saved every penny scraped paints for our front porch and had cornbread with homemade butter every Sunday. When our kids asked why we never bought fancy things, Jack would smile and say, "We have something more valuable than money, each other." And so we did. In 1997, after almost 30 years of marriage, Jack convinced me to sell our modest house and move to the outskirts of town, where he built with his own hands a wraparound porch dream home. It had 5 rooms, a large kitchen with a view of the fields behind us, and a yard filled with apple and cherry trees. He planted strawberries along the fence and grew peppers and herbs in wooden planters. As he hit his 60th birthday in 2007, we hosted a big backyard party, a celebration of community family, and a love that had endured through decades of change. But life has a way of reminding us that joy and sorrow are 2 sides of the same coin. One morning in early 2008, I noticed Jack's hands trembling over his coffee cup. He dropped the cup, shattering it on the porch's concrete floor. At first, we laughed it off as fatigue, but within weeks he was struggling to hold a spoon to button his shirt. He dropped tools at work and began tripping on the swings during his walks with me. He insisted his mind was fine, just tired, he said. But I knew something more serious was coming. After days of gentle persuasion, Jack agreed to see Dr. Carmen at the clinic in Lancaster. A battery of tests later, we sat in a neurologist's office in Philadelphia, clutching each other's hands as he said the words that would shape the rest of our lives: amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS. The disease would steal his ability to move, to speak, to swallow. We were told it could be a year or 3 before it claimed his life. That evening on the drive home, Jack cracked a joke to lighten the mood, but behind his forced grin, I saw fear pure, unfiltered fear. I reached over and took his hand. "Whatever happens," I whispered, "we'll face it together." He cried that night, a silent, steady stream, his tears a mirror of the pain I felt in my own heart. 40 years of strength and stoicism gave way to vulnerability, and in those tender moments we made invisible promises I would care for him as he had cared for me. I would find the grace to sit with him through every hardship. Over the next year, our children rallied. John took over the carpentry shop so Jack could rest. Mary brought meals from her new teaching job, and Lucy gave up her life in Philadelphia to be with us day and night. Our friends and neighbors turned our home into a tapestry of love. One built a wheelchair ramp, another cooked casseroles, and the church sent volunteers to give me breaks so I could breathe. Yet nothing could prepare me for the emptiness. On the day Jack died, March 15th, 2009, I woke before dawn, feeling a shift in the room's energy. His chest was still. I lay beside him, holding his hand as the first light of morning filtered through the curtains. He had slipped away quietly, just as he had asked without fuss, like someone leaving a party after dancing all night. I stayed there for hours, cherishing the warmth of his skin, the memory of his gentle voice. When I finally called the children, the world shifted again. But Lancaster showed its true colours. Neighbours arrived with hugs and casseroles, filling our small living room with stories of Jack's kindness and humour. We buried him simply surrounded by love, and I thought in that moment I might not survive without him. But life doesn't pause for grief. The doorbell rang 2 days later, and in walked Roger, Jack's younger brother, offering condolences that felt more like threats. He spoke of documents and the house, and lingered too long in my kitchen, his gaze full of something I couldn't yet name. I brushed aside the discomfort. Family should be family after all. But deep down, I knew that my story was far from over. And so, my dear friends, that brings us to where part 1 ends, in the soft aftermath of loss, with a home full of memories and a brother-in-law whose intention I could not yet fully understand. In part 2, we will journey through the storm of betrayal and the choices a woman makes when every path seems blocked. The days after Jack's funeral blurred into a haze of grief and quiet routine. Our children came and went like gentle tides, bringing food, tears, and words of comfort before returning to their own lives. But one morning I found myself alone in the house where I had shared 40 years of laughter and sorrow. The walls were too quiet, the furniture too still, as if mourning alongside me. That afternoon there was a knock on the door. I opened it to find Roger, Jack's younger brother, standing on the threshold. He'd come from Chicago as Jack's illness worsened, and at first he'd been kind, helping me with the garden, fixing a loose shutter, even bringing casseroles so I wouldn't have to cook. But now his eyes held something else. A cold calculation I didn't recognize, as though he were sizing up more than just the daylight fading behind me. "Jenny?" he said, his voice low and oddly eager. I thought I'd stay until all the paperwork is sorted. You know the house, the shop. He trailed off, gesturing to the living room, where boxes of Jack's things still waited to be unpacked. I forced a polite smile. "That's very thoughtful, Roger, but I really must sort through these myself." He shrugged, stepping inside uninvited. The door clicked shut behind him. I pointed to the boxes. "Everything I need is in there. I'll call you if I need help." He reached into his jacket pocket. "Actually, I found these," he said, pulling out a sheaf of papers. "I thought you might want to look at them." He dropped them on the coffee table: mortgage documents, utility bills, even what looked like my will. Everything in Jack's neat handwriting. My heart pounded. "I appreciate it," I said, my voice tight. "But I'll handle it." He leaned in, voice soft but urgent. "You know by law, half of his assets go to me. Since he didn't leave a new will, the house could be split 3 ways. His eyes flicked to mine, as though testing how I would react. I swallowed hard. Jack and I shared everything without formalities, I whispered. This was our home. He smiled, just a twitch at the corner of his mouth. I'm just looking out for the family, Jenny. Don't stress about it now. He pocketed the papers, and strode past me toward the door. As he left something in his gait, too confident, too possessive, left me trembling. I shut and locked the door, then sank against it in a wave of dread. That night, sleep eluded me. I thought of Jack's gentle hands, his steady gaze, and how different his brother's touch had felt. Over the next week, Roger's visits grew more frequent and intrusive. He rummaged through drawers when he thought I wasn't looking, asked pointed questions about my finances, and lingered in the rooms I and Jack had chosen together. One evening, after a lunch of leftover chicken casserole, he commented, "You're still looking good for your age, Jenny." Jack was a lucky man. His words landed like stones in my stomach. He winked, his gaze sliding over me as if I were an object on display. I stiffened. "Please," I said, standing up. "Don't speak to me that way." He chuckled, a low, mocking sound. "I'm just stating facts. You know, if it were me, I wouldn't let you out of the house." My breath caught, and I realized with a jolt that he'd been drinking not just wine with lunch or a nightcap, but something stronger. The hint of whiskey lingered on his breath. I backed away. "I think you should go home, Roger," I said, voice trembling. His smile faded. He followed me down the hall. His steps, too sure, too slow. My bedroom door stood between us, but before I could reach it, he grabbed my arm. Pain shot through me as his grip tightened. I wrenched free and ran for the door, flinging myself inside and slamming it shut. I bolted it and shoved the dresser against it, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure the whole house could hear. Beneath my feet, the floorboards creaked as Roger's shouts echoed through the thin walls. "Open this door, Jenny, you owe me, I'm family." I huddled on the bed, tears streaming down my face, rocking back and forth. I tried to will myself calm by counting backward from 100, but all I could see was his face, or rather the face of the man he had been before Jack died. This man was a stranger, a predator hiding behind a familiar name. Night crawled in slow motion. At some point, the shouting stopped. The silence that followed was worse, heavy, awaiting the next onslaught. I waited until the house was still, then crept to the door. It was unlocked. Probably my brute force had jarred it loose. I removed the dresser and tiptoed toward the phone by the living room window, my knees trembling. Then a crash of footsteps and a blow to the back of my head that sent stars of pain across my vision. I fell to my knees, hands pressed to where I felt warmth spreading through my hair. I never saw his face as he struck me again and again, but I felt the weight of his body, his twisted purpose. What followed was a blur of violence so personal, so cruel that years later I still fight the memory. When it was over, he lit a cigarette, his voice low and guttural. "You think you're better than me," he said. "Well, now you'll remember who I am." He laughed, and the sound chilled me more than any blow. Bleeding broken, I crawled across the floor to where I had once sat to read Jack's letters. I pressed my hand to the phone, but before I could dial, the world spun black. When I came to, I was lying in my sister Cindy's spare bedroom. The curtains were drawn, and the scent of mint tea filled the air. My head throbbed. My body ached, and the taste of iron lingered on my lips. Cindy sat beside me, her eyes red but fierce. "Shh," she said, pressing a cool cloth to my forehead. "Just rest. You're safe." I tried to speak, but my throat was raw. Cindy turned and filled a glass of water, bringing it to my lips. I took a sip, then managed Roger. He... She nodded. He did this to you. I know. I felt tears welling, and I buried my face in the pillow. How could the brother of the man I loved treat me like this? I thought of Jack, so gentle and steadfast, and hated my own body for its weakness. Over the next hours, I drifted between fevered nightmares and waking pain. Cindy cleaned my wounds with gentle hands, changed my clothes, and fed me broth. She didn't press me to tell every detail, she simply sat with me, a silent vigil in the dark. When morning came, the first ray of sunlight brought with it a dreadful realization. Roger was still in my house, helping himself to my life. My front door, left ajar in his arrogance, let in a slant of dawn that felt like accusation. I couldn't return there, to the place he'd violated, the memories he'd desecrated. Cindy sat me up and handed me a small carved wooden box. "This belonged to Grandma Ununis," she said in a low voice. "Our grandmother, the one who healed folks with herbs, and had her ways of getting justice when the law failed her." I remembered Grandma Ununis as gentle but formidable. She'd delivered our mother stitched up scraped knees and blessed eggs under the new moon. I'd never known about her other reputation, the one whispered among our elders. Cindy opened the box. Inside lay a yellowed notebook and a small vial of dried herbs. She handed me the notebook, her fingers steady, despite her trembling. "Read." I opened the cover to find neat looping script recipes for poultices, tinctures, and something else. A detailed concoction of roots and powders, described as for fevers that never break, accompanied by notes on dosage, onset of symptoms, and how to keep suspicion at bay. My breath caught. I read the words a second time. A recipe for a slow, undetectable poison, one that Grandma Ununis had supposedly used to rid the community of an abusive landowner who'd escaped justice. "I'm not suggesting murder," Cindy whispered. "But what if we could make him unable to walk, to stand? So he can't hurt you, so he can't lay claim to your home." My mind reeled. The law had failed me once he'd walked free after hurting me, citing family tensions as an excuse. The police might never believe a widow accusing her brother-in-law of rape. Even if they did, the process could take months, maybe years' time. I didn't have to feel safe. I closed the notebook. The weight of it felt enormous in my hands. "Could I live with myself?" I whispered. "Doing this?" Cindy cupped my face. "Jack taught you to stand up for what's right," she said. "This isn't about vengeance. It's about protecting yourself and your home." I thought of the day Jack died, of how I'd held his hand and promised to care for him. Now, with him gone, I was alone and dangerously vulnerable. If I did nothing, Roger would continue to seize everything we built together. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped low, we prepared a plan. We would not kill him, but incapacitate him. Aunt Jo, Grandma Ununis's eldest, would brew a mild elixir, 5 drops enough to leave him dizzy, weak in the knees, and confused for hours. Cindy would invite him over with a bottle of wine, claiming I'd collapsed from grief and needed help reconciling. When he drank, he wouldn't suspect the tea-colored liquid hiding those 5 drops of justice. My heart pounded at each detail: how to lure him, how to collect the keys and documents while he lay helpless, and how to leave him somewhere safe, but far away. Perhaps the bus station at dawn, a one-way ticket to Chicago in his pocket. Memories of his brother's home dwindling behind him. It was dangerous, reckless, and entirely unlike the Jenny I'd been steady, trusting, law-abiding. Yet I felt a flicker of something that had lain dormant for years, courage born of desperation. If the proper channels couldn't protect me, I would carve my own path. It was my home, my life, my story to defend. That night I closed my eyes and saw Jack's face, his steady blue eyes, his gentle smile. I whispered, "I'm doing this for us." And when the first star appeared in the sky, I made my choice. Tomorrow I would step into Grandma Unice's legacy and reclaim what was rightfully mine. In part 3, I'll tell you how we carried out that plan and what happened when 3 determined women confronted a man who had forgotten the meaning of family. That night, as the last sliver of sunset faded behind the rolling fields, Cindy and I slipped quietly out of her house. Aunt Jo walked with us to the edge of the road, clutching a small jar of amber-colored liquid. 5 drops, she whispered, pressing the vial into Cindy's hand. Not more, or he'll never wake. I swallowed hard, my heart hammering. I had never done anything like this before, nothing except bake pies and care for our family. Yet here I was, about to steal into my own home, lure its intruder back with a friendly smile, and betray him. We reached my front porch under the deepening sky. The lantern above the door cast a warm glow on the peeling paint and the potted ferns Jack had tended. For a moment I hesitated at the threshold, imagining Roger sprawled on the carpet or worse. But Cindy's gentle squeeze on my arm steeled my nerves. Inside the house felt empty, an echo chamber of memories. Photos of Jack and me on date nights. Our kids' finger paintings, the old guitar he'd strummed on summer evenings, all stared back at me. Cindy lifted a wine bottle from the kitchen counter, brandishing a cheery label. "Your favorite Merlot," she said. "He won't suspect a thing." She unscrewed the cap and dropped exactly 5 dark droplets into the bottle, then screwed the lid back on. In the living room, Roger sat in Jack's old armchair, a half-empty glass in hand, and a vacant expression on his face. When he heard us come in, he turned with a slur of surprise. "Jenny," he mumbled, as though struggling to place my face. "Maybe you can help me with these papers." I smiled and came forward. "I'm so sorry about earlier," I said softly. "I've been so distraught. Cindy and I thought perhaps a glass of wine might calm both of us." I gestured to the bottle. "Let me pour you another." As he took the offered glass, I realized how small he looked. Now his shoulders slumped, the confidence in his eyes gone. He sipped gratefully, then leaned back with a sigh. "Thank you, sis," he said, nodding at Cindy. "You two are good people." I felt a pang in my chest that this man had once been family, but only for a moment. When he set the glass down, shaking ever so slightly, I gave Cindy a barely perceptible nod. She slipped away into the hallway, leaving me alone with Roger. "Are you feeling okay?" I asked, keeping my voice light. He frowned. "Weird," he whispered, touching his throat, like my head's swimming. I crouched beside him. "Sit still for a moment. I'll get you some water." As I walked toward the kitchen, my legs trembled, not from fear, but from the enormity of what I was about to do. I filled a glass, then placed it on the coffee table beside his half-drunk wine. When I turned back, he was already slumped forward onto his knees, unmoving. Panic flared in me for an instant, had I misjudged the dose. But Aunt Jo's warning echoed 5 drops enough to weaken the legs and muddle the mind for hours, not kill. He lay twitching, reaching for support, but his arms jittered uselessly. I pressed a hand to his back and whispered, "It's all right, Roger. You're safe. Just rest." He mumbled something incoherent, and for the first time, I felt pity for this broken man. But I steeled myself. We could not leave him here to hurt someone else. He had to be removed from my home. I went outside and slipped in through the unlocked back gate, careful not to disturb the garden Jack had planted. Cindy was waiting by the fence, Aunt Jo beside her. We lifted Roger between us, his head lolling against my shoulder, and carried him into the night. He was heavier than I'd imagined, but neither of us complained. A short walk later, we reached the bus stop on the main road. A lone lamppost illuminated a bench. Cindy laid him down gently and fumbled in her purse for some cash and a folded slip of paper. On it was written Chicago Greyhound, along with a one-way ticket she'd pre-purchased. She tucked the ticket into his jacket pocket, then slipped back the hood of his coat. I bent to his ear. "You'll wake in a safe place, I promised. Go home, Roger. Go somewhere far." He murmured something about family and drifted back into unconsciousness. We watched for a moment, hearts pounding as a taxi whizzed past. The deserted street felt too bright, too exposed. Finally, Aunt Jo placed a hand on my arm. "He'll wake soon," she said. "He'll remember." I nodded, tears pricking my eyes at the betrayal of family and the loss of the home Jack and I had built together. "Thank you," I whispered, more to Jack's memory than to the women beside me. We walked back in silence, and when we reached the door, Cindy locked it firmly. Inside, I swept my hand across Jack's old photographs, collecting them into an armful. "He doesn't deserve to see these," I said. "Not after all he's done." We tucked the photos safely into a box, ready for me to restore them to their proper place. The next morning, we arrived at the Lancaster police station just after dawn. Roger sat in a metal-backed chair between two uniformed officers, his face bloated and bewildered. The young desk sergeant peered at us through thick lenses. "What's going on here?" he asked. I took a steadying breath. "This man," I said, gesturing to Roger, "attacked me in my own home. I reported the rape and he threatened my life. We found him trespassing in my house. He's been living there without my consent. Furthermore, he's been forging documents and threatening my property rights." The sergeant consulted his notes. Cindy and Aunt Jo stood behind me, silent witnesses. I handed over a spiral notebook, the one Aunt Jo's herb box had come in, containing the listing of Roger's threats, his admissions and records of missing deeds. I also turned over the bottle of wine we had used as a demonstration of his state of mind, empty, save for the poisoned droplets. He looked skeptical. "Poison in wine," he said. "That might complicate things." I nodded. "We'll testify to what happened. My sister and my aunt can back up my story. And we have the house deeds, the forged ID, and his own statements about taking half the property." Over the next few hours, I gave my statement enough to launch a criminal investigation into the rape, burglary, and identity fraud. It was invasive, humiliating, even a series of questions about my injuries. The timeline, the exact words he'd spoken. But I held firm. With each detail, I felt the weight lifting from my chest. By mid-morning, the police agreed to process the report. They promised to secure the house and assign an officer to keep an eye on it. As I stepped outside into the cool morning air, Cindy wrapped an arm around me. "You did the right thing," she said. "Jack would be proud." Back home under that same lantern light, we set to work rebuilding. We scrubbed the floors until they gleamed, polished the front door, and rehung family photos in fresh frames. Every sweep of the broom, every stroke of the rag felt like reclaiming a piece of the life Jack and I had shared. I cleaned out Roger's suitcase, old whiskey bottles, tattered clothes, a worn baseball cap, then locked it in the attic far from sight. In the weeks that followed, word spread through Lancaster why a 3-generation circle of women had toppled a would-be usurper and reclaimed a home. Neighbors came with casseroles, friends brought flowers, and my children rallied around me. John offered to install new locks. Mary enlisted our church group to pray for my healing, and Lucy helped me replant roses along the porch. In the courthouse, 3 months later, Roger appeared in handcuffs. The charges ranged from burglary and elder abuse to sexual assault and identity theft. I sat in the front row, flanked by Cindy and Aunt Jo, holding a photo of Jack as our eldest daughter, Lucy, took notes for her nursing studies. When the judge read out the sentence 7 years in state prison, I felt relief so deep it brought tears. Not vengeance, but justice. After the trial, life settled into a slower rhythm. I connected with a women's support group in nearby Lancaster City, sharing my story and listening to others. I found a counselor who taught me journaling techniques to process lingering trauma. On Tuesday mornings, I joined a walking group at a local community centre, something Jack and I used to do before ALS changed his steps. I also rediscovered my baking. What started as therapy, kneading dough, watching pies rise, turned into a small business. Grandma Jenny's Healing Pies. I delivered apple peach crumbles to widows' chicken pot pies, to new mothers, lemon ginger tarts, to friends in hospital beds. Each pie felt like a gift of resilience, a taste of comfort after so much upheaval. Neighbours began to recognise my doorstep by the aroma of cinnamon and sugar. The postmistress in town still teases me. Best thing about your house is the smell before you even open the door. And I laugh, because home now means safety community and a legacy of strength that Jack taught me, and that Cindy and Aunt Jo helped me claim back. 14 years have passed since that April night. I'm 87 now, grey-haired and slower in my steps. But every morning I light the lantern on the porch, brew a pot of coffee, and watch the sunrise behind the hills. I lean on my granddaughter Mia's arm as we plant new roses. I share my story to remind others that when the system fails, sisterhood can prevail, that justice need not end in vengeance, that a home is more than walls, it's the love and courage we build within them. If you're watching this and feel powerless, know that you are not alone. Reach out to a friend, a counselor, a hotline. Find your circle of support. And when you need to reclaim your story, remember a gentle heart can be the fiercest shield of all. I'll never forget the first morning after Roger's conviction. I woke before dawn, heart still pounding from the nightmares that had haunted me for months. But for the first time in a long while, the terror had receded just enough to let in a sliver of hope. I made my way to the kitchen where the coffee pot gurgled its familiar promise of warmth, and I realized this was the moment I'd been waiting for. It was time to rebuild. I started small. I unpacked the box of Jack's photographs that Cindy and Aunt Jo had helped me rescue. I hung them on the walls in new frames, breathing life back into the living room that had once felt stained by betrayal. Each picture a family picnic in Atlantic City, the three of us dancing under candles. Little Lucy's first steps reminded me of who I was before the darkness descended. I touched the glass gently as though greeting an old friend. Next, I reached out for help. In Lancaster, there's a small non-profit called Safe Hearth Collective that runs support groups for survivors of domestic violence. I phoned the coordinator, Angela, and found myself invited to their Tuesday morning circle at the community centre. On my first visit, I sat in a circle of folding chairs surrounded by women I didn't yet know. Mothers, teachers, grandmothers, all of us seeking a safe space to share. When I spoke, my voice cracked on the first words. My name is Jenny, and I was raped by my brother-in-law. The room fell quiet. One woman reached over and squeezed my hand. Another simply nodded, tears in her eyes. I realized I was far from alone. Over the next few weeks, those Tuesday mornings became an anchor. We practiced grounding exercises, naming 5 things we could see, 4 we could touch, 3 we could hear to calm our racing minds. We exchanged numbers, met for coffee, and walked the park trails together when the days grew warmer. Outside the group, I found a counselor, Dr. Martinez, who specialized in trauma therapy. She taught me how to journal in a way that wasn't just dumping pain onto the page, but transforming it, writing letters to my younger self, drafting forgiveness for men I'd known who never deserved it, composing scenes of a future where I felt whole. I still tremble sometimes when the memories surge up, but the trembling is no longer paralyzing. It's proof that I'm alive and feeling. At home, I discovered that baking could heal more than hunger. One afternoon, as I stirred the cinnamon sugar mixture for my apple peach crumble, I realized the simple act of kneading dough soothed my hands and my heart. I started baking extra pies and delivering them to my neighbors' widows who lived alone, the new parents down the road, the single dad whose teenage son had moved out for college. Each pie came with a note: a little sweetness for your day. Love, Jenny. Word spread, of course, us. Soon the postmistress began saving me old mailer boxes so I could pack pies for people who lived farther away. A local cafe asked if I'd sell a few slices on their dessert menu. Before I knew it, Jenny's healing pies had become a weekend ritual for friends and strangers alike. When someone tasted that first warm bite, I saw their eyes close and a soft smile appear, and I felt a glimmer of my old self returning. As spring turned to summer, I leaned into community in other ways. I signed up to speak at a fundraiser for Safe Hearth Collective, sharing my story on stage under bright lights. My voice wavered as I recounted that April night, but I also spoke of the three women, my sister, my aunt, and my grandmother's legacy, who helped me reclaim my life. Afterwards, attendees crowded around me, offering hugs, tears, and promises to volunteer. I felt what I'd never felt before, that my pain could become purpose. I also connected with legal advocates who worked pro bono to support domestic violence survivors. I met with a young lawyer, Priya, who helped me draft an op-ed for the local paper about the gaps in protection for widows and elderly spouses. Together, we laid out practical steps for community members: how to recognize warning signs, how to report abuse, where to turn for confidential counseling. Watching it in print, I felt my voice carry farther than I ever imagined. Back at home, the garden Jack and I had planted was coming alive again. I kneaded in fresh soil beneath the cherry tree and coaxed new strawberries from the vines. Each green sprout felt like another chance to nurture life instead of dread. My granddaughter Mia would help me pick the first ripe berries, her laughter like birdsong lifting the veil of sorrow from that little corner of the yard. I taught her how to press the fruit gently into jam jars, labeling each one Grandma's sweet hope. On Sundays, when the sky was wide and the air smelled of honeysuckle, I walked the neighborhood wearing my sun hat and a basket of scones. I waved at passers-by, greeted the Amish families driving by in their buggies, and let laughter ripple down the quiet lanes. Each step reminded me that fear no longer had to define my days. I was reclaiming my right to peace and pleasure. I also found solace in learning new things. I enrolled in a creative writing class at the local college, where I met students half my age but full of curiosity. Together we critiqued essays, shared prompts, and marveled at the power of metaphor. I wrote a short story about a barn owl who guides a wounded woman through the night. And when the class applauded, I realized I was once again discovering joy in creation. In those months of rebuilding, I made peace with the fact that some memories would never fade. I still flinch at slamming doors, still wake sometimes in a panic from a nightmare. But the nightmares grow shorter and the daylight lingers longer. Each morning when I set out my coffee cup on the porch and watch the sunrise, I say a quiet thanks to Jack for his love, his example, his courage in the face of ALS. And I say thanks to Cindy and Aunt Jo for their unwavering loyalty, their ingenious plan, and their refusal to let me face that monster alone. If there's one truth I want you to carry away, it's this: healing rarely comes in a straight line. It winds its way through tears, through relapses of fear, through moments when you wonder if you'll ever feel whole again. But healing also comes in the scent of fresh-baked pie, in the chorus of a support group, in the first line of a poem you never thought you'd write. It comes in picking up a photograph and remembering the laughter behind it. I've learned that true justice isn't about vengeance. It's about reclaiming your story, rewriting the next chapter in your own hand. The law can help, but it's the circle of women, the kindness of neighbors, the power of kindness to strangers that lights the way home. So if you're out there carrying a secret wound, know that you deserve care, compassion, and a safe place to rest. Reach out to a friend, to a hotline, to a counselor. Bake that pie, write that letter, plant those seeds in the garden. And remember, every sunrise is an invitation to begin again. In Part 5, we'll explore how sharing our stories out loud can transform entire communities, and how you too can find your voice to spark change. When the op-ed ran in the Lancaster Gazette, I held the newspaper in my hands and felt a flutter of nerves I hadn't known since before Jack fell ill. The headline read, "From Darkness to Dawn. One widow's journey to justice, and inside was my story. Every hardship, every moment of fear, but also every triumph and act of kindness that followed." I remembered the hollow feeling in the courtroom, the way my knees had quivered when the judge pronounced sentence on Roger. Now my words were reaching dozens of readers, perhaps hundreds, which in a town our size feels like a small revolution. A few days later, I received an invitation. It came on letterhead from the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence. They wanted me to speak at their annual conference in Harrisburg. I traced the elegant cursive with a trembling finger. Me, a small-town grandma who never even finished high school. But then I thought of Jack's faith in me, of Cindy, and Aunt Jo's unshakable confidence, and I wrote back, "I'm honored. I'll be there." On the day of the conference, I dressed carefully soft blue blouse, simple pearl earrings, and fastened a pin that read, "Survivor and Advocate." As I walked into the state capitol's grand hall, the marble columns and high ceilings made my heart pound. Yet when I took the podium, looked out at a sea of faces, social workers, lawyers, fellow survivors, I felt something shift. I cleared my throat, adjusted the microphone, and began. "My name is Jenny Miller," I said, voice steady. "I come from Lancaster County, where I lived for over 60 years in a home my husband and I built. After his death, I faced betrayal and violence from the one person I should have been able to trust most. But I refused to let that broken trust define the rest of my life. I told them about the dark hours in my bedroom, the herbal vial from Grandma Eunice's notebook, and the way Cindy and Aunt Jo stood beside me like pillars of strength. I shared how I found my voice in the courtroom, how I found healing in a circle of women, and how pie, of all things, became both literal and metaphorical nourishment. The hall was silent. When I finished, the applause felt like a wave lifting me higher than any courtroom verdict ever could. Afterward, people came forward, an attorney offering pro bono assistance to elderly survivors, a social worker asking if I'd help create a curriculum for high school students about healthy relationships, and a young woman with tears in her eyes who whispered, "Your story saved my life." I realized then that my journey was no longer only mine. It belonged to every woman who thought herself alone. Back in Lancaster, I built on that momentum. With support from the Safe Hearth Collective, I helped organize a community symposium called Voices of Courage. We held it in the old Armory Hall, long rows of folding chairs, a modest stage adorned with sunflowers in memory of Jack. We invited speakers, a nurse who specialized in trauma care, a police officer passionate about victim advocacy, and even Cindy, who spoke about the importance of family solidarity in crisis. I moderated a panel of local survivors, each of us sharing 10-minute stories that ranged from emotional neglect to outright violence. We paired each story with practical resources pamphlets on obtaining protective orders stickers with the hotline number 1-800-799-SAFE and contact lists for counselling services. By the end of the night, the hall felt electric, as if fear had been replaced by resolve. Neighbours lingered afterward over coffee, exchanging hugs and phone numbers. A local florist donated bouquets, so every attendee left with something bright in their hands. That same autumn, I decided to write a book. I'd never claimed to be a writer, but I felt the pull to capture not just my own story, but the interwoven threads of my family's legacy. Eunice's courage, Aunt Jo's wisdom, Cindy's fierce loyalty, and Jack's enduring kindness. I titled it Harvesting Hope, a family's story of love loss and liberation, and I wrote each afternoon at my kitchen table, often pausing to test a new pie recipe or to press wildflowers between the pages. When the manuscript was finished, a small publisher in Philadelphia agreed to take it on. Launch night in Lancaster was held at the library where friends and neighbours filled every seat. I read a passage about the first Tuesday I walked into that support group, how the circle of folding chairs felt like a path out of the forest. Some faces nodded along, others sat stone-faced, tears glistening. When I closed the book, a hush fell, then a standing ovation that echoed off the bookshelves. Proceeds from the book sales went to fund a scholarship for survivors to attend healing retreats. I heard from women as far away as Pittsburgh and Erie who applied telling me they felt empowered to reach out because of Harvesting Hope. Every time I signed a copy, I added a personal note. For your journey with love, Jenny. Meanwhile, my baking grew into a weekend workshop series at the community centre, Pies and Purpose. We gathered around long tables rolling out dough and talking about self-care boundaries and how food can nourish both body and spirit. At the first session, I worried it might feel too frivolous. But by the end, the room was alive with conversation. We laughed over flower fights, someone cried over the memory of their mother's kitchen, and each participant left with a handmade pie and a renewed sense of camaraderie. One woman, a retired teacher named Dolores, confided that she'd been a survivor herself, but never felt she belonged to a community until that day. I realized then that the act of baking together, kneading, mixing, tasting, became a form of therapy, a modern echo of Grandma Eunice's herbal gatherings, only this time with sugar and spice. As winters came and went, I found my voice in yet another way through local radio. Mornings with Maggie invited me for a weekly segment called Jenny's Corner, where I shared simple tips like herbal teas to soothe anxiety and encouraged callers to tell their stories. One morning, a young man named Marcus called in, asking how to support his sister who'd been in an abusive relationship. Together on live air, we discussed how to help her find a safe shelter and connect with legal aid. Later, Marcus emailed me to say his sister was now in counselling and had started a night school program. That message glowed on my desk like a beacon. Perhaps the most unexpected invitation came from a local high school. The principal asked if I would speak to students during their health and wellness week. I confess I hesitated. What could I possibly say to teenagers? But then I thought of Lucy and her college friends, of the conversations I'd had with Mary when she was teaching young children. And I agreed. Standing before a room of 17 and 18-year-olds, I shared an abridged version of my journey. I talked about consent, respect, and the importance of speaking up when something felt wrong. I emphasized that help could be as simple as calling a trusted adult or a hotline. Afterward, the students lined up with notebooks, asking questions about everything from what if the abuser is your family to how do you rebuild trust in yourself. We stayed past the bell, their curiosity, a reminder that preventive education can ripple outward to protect countless young lives. Through all these endeavors, I never lost sight of the quiet power of everyday kindness. I still bake pies on Fridays, and I still wake before sunrise to light the lantern on my porch. When I look out at the dew-kissed grass or breathe in the scent of honeysuckle, I remind myself the smallest rituals can ground us in hope. Last month, on the anniversary of Roger's sentencing, I hosted a gathering at the Lancaster Community Garden. We planted a row of rose bushes, red for resilience, yellow for friendship, white for remembrance. Each rose marked a step forward, aimed for survivors who found courage, for families who rebuilt trust, for communities that chose solidarity over silence. As we knelt in the soil together, digging holes and whispering wishes, I felt something shift in the earth beneath my fingertips. It felt like peace. Now, at 88 years young, I see that my life has become a tapestry of stories woven together, the story of Jack and our dreams, the story of betrayal and survival, the story of a family that refused to break, and the stories of countless others who found strength in our journey. When I share these stories on stage, in print, in a kitchen full of flour, they take on a life of their own. They remind me that even when the darkest night seems endless, dawn is always possible. So if you're holding this video close to your heart, know that you too have a story worth telling. You are not alone. Reach out, find your circle, share a pie, write a line, plant a seed. Let your voice be heard, because in sharing our stories we light a path for one another, and together we turn the page toward a brighter chapter.